All right, let me guide you through the events of the past 72 hours, since this is truly astonishing and the U.S. media isn't giving you the complete picture. Donald Trump is currently confiding in his nearest advisors that he desires to exit the USMCA entirely, completely gone. This is the pact involving the United States, Mexico, and Canada, the commerce arrangement that oversees $1.6 trillion in yearly exchanges among our three countries, $1.6 trillion. And he aims to dismantle it. Now, here's what renders this so remarkably irresponsible. Trump personally brokered this accord during his initial presidency. He was present at the signing event, claimed full praise, declared it the finest commerce pact in the annals of such pacts, perhaps of all time. Those were his exact phrases. And now, merely a couple of years on, he is inquiring from his assistants what advantages the U.S. actually receives from remaining part of it. The guy doesn't even recall the reasons he endorsed his own pact. But here's where things become truly fascinating. Mark Carney isn't going along with it. The Canadian Prime Minister has examined Trump's warnings, reviewed his bravado regarding duties and revisions, and basically responded no. Not simply no, but absolutely not. And the figures support him completely. Allow me to clarify what Carney has accomplished here, since this is a masterclass in dealing with an intimidator. Back in February of 2026, Trump approached negotiations with five extensive requirements that would have basically restructured the Canadian economy to benefit U.S. priorities. He sought complete entry to Canada's dairy sector, which would have ruined Canadian agriculturists. He demanded Canada abolish its digital content regulations, those that safeguard Canadian material and heritage. He insisted on removing provincial liquor limitations so U.S. beer and wine could saturate the marketplace. He requested alterations to public purchasing guidelines so U.S. firms could outbid Canadian enterprises on their home turf. And he desired a rewrite of Canadian energy strategy to ensure delivery to the United States irrespective of Canadian requirements. 5 requirements. Carney turned down everyone, all of them. And this isn't some impulsive action by a novice official. Carney entered this role with a strategy. He devoted the previous year to broadening Canada's commerce connections. While Trump was issuing threats of duties, Canada was finalizing pacts with the European Union, with Asian economies, with South American counterparts. Carney grasped something essential that evidently eludes Trump altogether. Canada doesn't rely on the United States as much as the United States relies on Canada. Consider that briefly. America brings in more from Canada than from any other individual nation. Energy, resources, produced items, farm goods, the distribution networks that maintain U.S. plants operating, that keep U.S. residences warm, that keep U.S. food shops supplied, they flow via Canada. And Carney recognizes this. So when Trump began applying duties earlier this year, what occurred? U.S. buyers paid higher amounts. U.S. enterprises paid higher amounts. The expense of living in the United States increased. Meanwhile, Canada shifted shipments to alternative destinations. The hardship that Trump believed he was imposing on Canada fell directly on U.S. households. There was a study released on March 14, 2026, and I need you to truly absorb this since it clarifies everything. The study indicated that Carney has tactically outplayed the United States by proving that U.S. duties mainly affect U.S. buyers and U.S. enterprises, not Canadians. This isn't hypothetical. This is what has really taken place. Costs rose in Pittsburgh and Phoenix, not in Toronto and Vancouver. Canada broadened its options. Canada developed substitutes. And now when Trump warns of exiting USMCA, Carney can dismiss it and say, proceed, we'll manage, you won't. This is why Trump is enraged. This is why he is currently discussing abandoning his own commerce pact. He believed he could coerce Canada the way he coerces everybody else. He assumed Carney would yield, and Carney exposed his deception. Now, allow me to describe the schedule here since this is important. The USMCA includes a scheduled evaluation procedure. Every 6 years, the 3 nations must convene and determine whether to extend the pact. That evaluation is set to start on July 1st, 2026. We are under 4 months from that deadline. Two-way talks between the United States and Mexico commenced on March the 17th, 2026, only days back. Canada's anticipated to participate in those discussions subsequently. But here's the key. Carney isn't hurrying. He doesn't have to be present immediately because he possesses the advantages. Mexico is anxious. Mexico requires entry to U.S. marketplaces, but Canada has alternatives. And Trump realizes this, which is why he is already mentioning departure prior to the evaluation formally starting. He seeks to generate disorder. He aims to fabricate an emergency so he can assert he is acting firmly, so he can inform his supporters that he is defending America against unjust commerce associates. But the truth is precisely the reverse. If Trump exits USMCA, U.S. producers forfeit tariff-free entry to Canadian marketplaces. U.S. agriculturists lose their primary export location. U.S. energy firms lose assured entry to Canadian assets. The interconnected distribution networks that render North American production competitive worldwide, they disintegrate. And Carney has been quite explicit about his position. On March 16, 2026, merely 2 days prior, Carney delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and what he stated there ought to have been headline material in every U.S. publication. But naturally, it wasn't because the U.S. media doesn't want you to comprehend what is really occurring. Carney stated that the American rules-based global system has concluded. Consider those terms. The American system has concluded. He isn't discussing some remote future chance. He is outlining the present situation, and he is informing the globe that Canada is advancing with an approach centered on economic self-reliance and national determination, not on expecting that America will revert to being a dependable associate. This is a prime minister who examined decades of U.S. supremacy and commerce ties and declared that period is finished and we aren't lingering for you to realize it. We are constructing our tomorrow without you. That isn't merely daring. That is a total dismissal of the premise that has directed North American ties for eras. The premise that Canada requires U.S. endorsement, U.S. marketplaces, U.S. benevolence to prosper. Carney is declaring, no, we don't, not any longer. So what does Trump genuinely desire here? Because if you heed his open declarations, it shifts daily. At times, he claims he wants to revise USMCA to secure improved conditions for America. At times, he claims he wants to discard the entire matter and broker distinct two-way pacts with Canada and Mexico. At times, he simply grumbles that the pact is inequitable without detailing what he would modify. But here's what I believe is actually occurring. Trump lacks a plan. He possesses gut feelings, and his gut feelings inform him that seeming strict on commerce resonates with his supporters. So he warns of duties, he warns of exit, he issues requirements that he knows can't be fulfilled. All so he can portray himself as the robust leader battling for U.S. laborers. The issue is that Mark Carney isn't participating in that scheme. Carney possesses genuine policy objectives. Carney has a genuine plan, and Carney has performed the calculations. When Trump applied duties on Canadian steel and aluminum, Canada promptly countered with precise duties on U.S. items from areas represented by major Republican legislators. That is tactical. When Trump warned of duties on Canadian energy, Canada began vending more oil and gas to Asian marketplaces. That is tactical. When Trump required modifications to Canadian digital content regulations, Canada instead reinforced alliances with European partners who possess comparable guidelines. That is tactical. And now we are observing the ties deteriorate live. The USMCA, this $1.6 trillion pact that was intended to deliver steadiness and foreseeability to North American commerce, is barely surviving. And it isn't because Canada departed. It is because the United States under Trump has resolved that accords and pacts and global obligations are insignificant. You must grasp what a significant matter this is. USMCA succeeded NAFTA, which had existed since January 1st, 1994. For over 25 years, North American commerce functioned under NAFTA. And despite all the political talk, it succeeded. It formed interconnected distribution networks. It permitted expertise and productivity. It rendered all three nations more competitive internationally. Then Trump revised it into USMCA, which became effective on July the 1st, 2020. So we have had USMCA operating for fewer than 6 years. 6 years. And Trump already desires out. Do you realize what that communicates to the remainder of the globe? It communicates that America's promise means zilch. It communicates that even if you bargain with the United States sincerely, even if you offer yields and achieve a pact, the subsequent U.S. government or even the identical government a few years on will simply shred it. Why would anybody trust the United States as a commerce associate in those situations? And this is where Carney has been utterly ingenious. He anticipated this. When Trump secured re-election, Carney didn't squander time wishing for improvement. He promptly began developing options. He bolstered the CETA pact with the European Union. He increased commerce with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. He focused on enhancing ties with South American nations. Canada is now less reliant on the U.S. marketplace than at any stage in contemporary history, and that provides Carney influence that prior Canadian prime ministers never possessed. When Trump states he will apply 25% duties on Canadian items, Carney can state, "Proceed. We'll vend to Europe as an alternative." When Trump states he wants to revise energy setups, Carney can state, "Okay, we'll ship our oil and gas to Asia." When Trump requires yields on dairy or digital content or purchasing, Carney can refuse and enforce it. This isn't how the ties are meant to function, at least not from the U.S. viewpoint. The United States is accustomed to being the controlling associate, the one who establishes the conditions. But Carney has basically altered that balance. So what occurs next? Well, the formal USMCA evaluation is meant to commence on July 1st, 2026. But if Trump acts on his warnings, if he really starts exit, the United States would need to provide 6 months written alert. That means the soonest the U.S. could truly leave the pact would be 6 months following notification. But here's the point. The doubt alone is harmful. Enterprises need to organize. They need to commit funds, employ staff, construct sites, and they can't accomplish that when they don't know if the fundamental structure of North American commerce will persist in 6 months or a year. So U.S. companies are already beginning to protect themselves. They are considering relocating manufacturing to Mexico or Canada to preserve tariff-free entry to those marketplaces. If the U.S. departs, they are broadening distribution networks away from border reliances. They are, in other words, viewing the United States as an undependable associate. And each time they make one of those choices, that is employment and funding departing the United States. That is economic action that won't return even if Trump alters his opinion later. Meanwhile, Carney is enjoying popularity in Canada. His support levels have surged because Canadians view him resisting Trump. They view him declining to be intimidated. They view him defending Canadian priorities even when it involves dispute with the United States. This is a massive political victory for Carney at home, and it is a massive political issue for Trump, though he might not recognize it yet. Because when the financial harm from this commerce dispute begins to affect U.S. laborers, when plants begin shutting because they can't obtain Canadian materials, when energy costs surge because Canadian deliveries are shifted elsewhere, U.S. voters are going to question why this was essential. Trump will fault Canada. He always faults another party. But the details will narrate a different tale. The details will demonstrate that Trump destroyed a functioning commerce pact, that he issued requirements Canada had full right to decline, that he initiated a conflict he couldn't succeed, and this aligns with a wider trend that Carney noted in his Davos address. The American-led global system is falling apart not due to outside rivals, though they are present, but because America itself has turned undependable. America abandons treaties. America applies duties on partners. America views global pacts as recommendations instead of obligations. Other nations are observing and they are adapting. The European Union is developing strategic independence. Asian countries are forming commerce structures that exclude the United States. And Canada is broadening away from reliance on U.S. marketplaces. This is an enormous change in worldwide economic influence, and it is occurring right now in live action, and most Americans are unaware because the media isn't reporting it accurately. Instead, you receive articles about how Trump is acting strict on commerce, how he is battling for U.S. laborers, how he won't allow other nations to exploit us, but none of that is accurate. Trump isn't acting strict. He is acting irresponsibly. And the individuals who will bear the cost are U.S. laborers and U.S. buyers. Let me concentrate for a moment on energy because this is vital and it gets ignored. Canada is the biggest overseas provider of oil to the United States. Not merely a significant provider, the biggest. U.S. processing plants, especially in the Midwest, are particularly designed to handle Canadian thick crude. You can't simply substitute that with oil from elsewhere without huge facility commitments. So when Trump warns of duties on Canadian energy, or when he requires that Canada assure delivery irrespective of Canadian requirements, he is endangering U.S. energy stability. If Canada shifts even a segment of its oil shipments to Asian marketplaces, prices in the United States will jump. There is no alternative. And Carney recognizes this. He knows that energy is influence. So when Trump issues requirements, Carney can refer to the energy ties and say, are you certain you want to engage in this? Are you certain you want to hazard U.S. fuel costs rising $1 per gallon just prior to an election? That is genuine strength, and it is strength that Canada has not usually exercised this manner. But Carney isn't a conventional Canadian Prime Minister. He is prepared to employ the influence Canada possesses. The identical applies to production. The North American vehicle sector is fully merged across the three nations. A vehicle built in Michigan could have a motor from Ontario, a gearbox from Mexico, components from all three nations. The elements traverse borders several times during the production procedure. If Trump exits USMCA, all those border traversals become liable to duties. The expense of producing a vehicle in the United States rises substantially. U.S. vehicle firms become less competitive internationally, and employment shifts to Canada, Mexico, where producers can still exchange tariff-free with one another and with other marketplaces. This isn't speculative. This is what will occur. And vehicle sector leaders are already informing the Trump government this. But Trump doesn't mind because he believes he can intimidate his path to an improved pact. Except Carney isn't going to offer him an improved pact. Carney is going to allow Trump to dismantle USMCA if that's what he desires, and then Canada will adapt and proceed, and America will be stuck with a costlier, less competitive production area. Now let me discuss one of Trump's particular requirements, because it demonstrates how detached from facts this entire situation is. Trump desires complete U.S. entry to the Canadian dairy sector. He has been protesting about Canadian dairy guidelines for years. Here's the point. The Canadian dairy sector is small relative to the general commerce ties. Canada employs supply control for dairy, which means output is regulated to align with local demand and prices remain steady. Canadian agriculturists rely on this setup. It is politically favored in Canada. So Trump is prepared to dismantle a $1.6 trillion commerce pact over entry to a dairy sector valued at a few hundred million. That is the real calculation. He is jeopardizing massive financial harm to both nations for what equates to a minor detail in the overall ties. And Carney has refused because obviously he refused. No Canadian Prime Minister could consent to demolish the dairy supply control setup merely to satisfy Trump. It would be political disaster at home, and it would establish an example that Canada will surrender on any matter if the United States exerts sufficient force. So Carney refused, and Trump is having a fit, and now the whole commerce ties are endangered over dairy guidelines. If you are viewing this from Canada, you must grasp that your administration is battling for you. Carney isn't retreating because retreating would signify accepting a lasting inferior role in the ties with the United States. It would signify accepting that Canadian guidelines, Canadian heritage, Canadian economic priorities are all contingent on U.S. endorsement. That is not tolerable. That is not how independent countries engage. And Carney is ensuring the globe knows that Canada will not tolerate it. If you are viewing this from the United States, you must grasp that your administration is deceiving you about what is occurring. Trump isn't battling for U.S. laborers. He is endangering U.S. employment and U.S. wealth to satisfy his pride and appeal to his supporters. And when the financial harm arrives, he will fault Canada. But it will be his responsibility. Now, I have been concentrating mainly on Canada, but we can't overlook Mexico in this because Mexico is the additional participant in USMCA, and Mexico is in a quite distinct situation than Canada. Mexico is more reliant on the U.S. marketplace. Mexico has fewer substitute commerce associates. Mexico has more to forfeit if USMCA falls apart. So Mexico is worried, and Mexico is more prepared to offer yields to preserve the pact. Trump recognizes this, which is why the United States initiated two-way discussions with Mexico prior to involving Canada. Trump is attempting to separate Canada. He is attempting to get Mexico to consent to conditions that Canada won't approve and then utilize that to coerce Canada. But Carney isn't succumbing to it. Canada is entirely prepared to permit the United States and Mexico to broker their own two-way setup if that's what they desire. Canada will manage either way, and that assurance, that readiness to depart, is making Trump insane. He is accustomed to individuals needing him more than he needs them, but Carney has reversed the narrative. Remember, if Trump chooses to exit USMCA, he must provide 6 months written alert, 6 months. That is the regulation in the pact. So let's say Trump begins exit in April of 2026. That means USMCA would stay effective until October of 2026. During those 6 months, enterprises would be desperately reorganizing their activities to ready for the after USMCA era. Distribution networks would be redesigned, commitments would be relocated, employment would shift, and all that interruption would occur even if at the conclusion of 6 months, Trump altered his opinion and attempted to undo the exit. Because once enterprises lose trust, once they cease believing that the pact will stay effective, the harm is accomplished. This is what Trump doesn't comprehend. He believes he can warn of exit, employ it as influence, and then retreat at the final moment. But the warning itself inflicts genuine financial damage. The doubt itself prompts choices that can't readily be reversed. What amazes me about Carney is that he is pursuing the extended strategy. He isn't responding to Trump's everyday incitements. He isn't being pulled into social media disputes or media event debates. He is systematically developing the economic and foreign ties that will enable Canada to succeed no matter what the United States does. That is guidance. That is planning. And it contrasts sharply with the disorder and rashness that defines Trump's method. Carney has examined the path of U.S. politics and determined that the United States can't be depended on as a consistent associate. Perhaps that shifts in the future. Perhaps a different U.S. government will reinstate some degree of foreseeability and regard for global obligations. But Carney isn't wagering Canada's tomorrow on that chance. Instead, he is constructing a Canada that can triumph in a world where America is no longer the dependable dominant force it once was. And that is precisely what he ought to be doing. When Carney declared in Davos that the American rules-based global system has concluded, he was outlining a deep transformation. For decades following World War II, the United States established the regulations for global commerce and foreign affairs. Other nations might not have always appreciated those regulations, but they were regulations. There was foreseeability. There was a structure. Trump has destroyed that structure. He has demonstrated that the United States will disregard global law when suitable, will exit treaties arbitrarily, will apply duties breaching WTO regulations, will handle partners and opponents basically identically. And so other nations are developing new structures that don't rely on U.S. guidance. The EU is doing it, China is doing it, and now Canada is doing it. This is a historical alteration. And it is occurring largely because of Trump's method to commerce and foreign affairs. He believed he was rendering America powerful by being unforeseeable and confrontational. Instead, he is rendering America insignificant. So we return to the core inquiry. What occurs to the $1.6 trillion in yearly exchanges that circulate between the United States, Canada, and Mexico under USMCA? If Trump exits, that commerce doesn't simply vanish, but it becomes costlier, it becomes more intricate, it becomes less productive, and over time some of it relocates elsewhere. As firms reorganize to evade the difficulties of exchanging with the United States, Canada will shift more shipments to Europe and Asia. Mexico will do likewise, and U.S. firms will discover themselves isolated from the merged North American marketplace that has been the basis of their competitiveness. This is loss, loss, loss. All three nations are disadvantaged if USMCA falls apart. But Trump either doesn't comprehend that or doesn't mind, because he is concentrated on brief political placement rather than extended economic facts. And Carney has determined that there is no value in attempting to argue with someone who doesn't mind about facts. So Canada is readying for the worst while anticipating the best. Here's the essential point. Donald Trump is warning of exiting a commerce pact that he personally brokered that oversees $1.6 trillion in yearly exchanges because he isn't obtaining yields from Canada that Canada has full right to deny. Mark Carney has exposed his deception by developing substitute commerce ties and proving that Canada can succeed without U.S. collaboration. The formal USMCA evaluation starts on July 1st, 2026, but the ties are already deteriorating because Trump has rendered the United States an undependable associate. U.S. laborers and buyers will bear the cost for this irresponsibility through elevated costs, forfeited employment, and diminished competitiveness. And the remainder of the globe is observing and discovering that the period of U.S. economic guidance is finished. Not because America was overcome by a competitor, but because America overcame itself through its own narrow-viewed guidelines. That is our situation. That is what is occurring at this moment. And nearly none of the U.S. media is informing you the facts about it because they are more focused on reporting Trump's newest shocking remark than in clarifying the real results of his guidelines. But the results are genuine, and they are approaching. And when U.S. households are spending more for food and fuel, when U.S. plant laborers are forfeiting their employment because their bosses can't compete any longer, recall this instant. Recall that this was a decision. Recall that Trump decided to destroy a functioning commerce ties for no valid cause. And recall that Mark Carney provided him every chance to retreat and Trump declined. Canada will manage. Mexico will adapt. But America is on the verge of discovering a highly costly insight about what occurs when you view your nearest partners as foes and your global obligations as valueless.